They killed them all. They shot her son, Tsar Nicholas II, in a cellar. They shot her daughter-in-law, the German woman she despised. They bayoneted her 5 grandchildren. They hunted down and murdered her other son. But they never got her. She was Maria Feodorovna, Dowager Empress of Russia, and she was the one who got away. She was the lone survivor rescued by a British warship from the edge of the massacre, while her family was being erased. But this is not the story of a lucky escape. This is the far more tragic story of what came after. This is the story of a mother who lived for another 10 years, imprisoned in a seaside villa in Denmark, haunted by ghosts. This is the story of a woman who, to survive the unbearable truth of that cellar, had to build a fortress in her own mind, a denial so vast, tragic, and absolute that it rewrote reality. She died waiting for her murdered children to come home. The real woman who would become Maria Feodorovna is not found in the glittering, snowbound palaces of St. Petersburg. She is found in a modest, happy, and slightly chaotic palace in Copenhagen. She began as Princess Dagmar of Denmark, born in 1847, into a loving, noble but poor family. Her upbringing was frugal and remarkably normal, defined by her inseparable lifelong bond with her older sister Alex. Alex was the serene beauty, Minnie the vivacious charmer. Everything changed in 1863 when her father became King Christian IX, the father-in-law of Europe. Her sister Alex married the heir to the British throne, and the grandest prize, Imperial Russia, came for Minnie. She was 17 and fell deeply in love with the heir, Tsarevich Nicholas. It was a perfect fairy tale romance, but it shattered when Nixa fell ill with meningitis. Minnie raced to his deathbed in Nice, a house of horrors. Also there, watching, was Nixa's younger brother, the giant, shy Sasha. As Nixa died, he famously placed Minnie's hand in his brother's, leaving her to him, a widow before she was a wife. Minnie returned to Denmark, heartbroken. A year later, Sasha, now the unprepared heir, proposed. Torn between betraying her love and honoring his wish, she finally accepted. The fairy tale was back on, but darker. She left for Russia, transforming into Grand Duchess Maria Feodorovna. The frugal princess thrived, electrifying the stiff Russian court with her charm and fashion, and the people adored her as the Angel of Russia. Her marriage to Sasha, the giant who worshipped her, blossomed into a deep, loyal love. For 15 idyllic years, they lived at the Anichkov Palace, raising their children, including her beloved heir, Nikki. She and Alex were 2 girls who had conquered the world. Then on March 13, 1881, the idol was blown to pieces. Maria heard 2 bombs. Her father-in-law, Tsar Alexander II, had been assassinated. She, Sasha, and the 12-year-old Nikki rushed to a bloodbath and watched him die. In that instant, her weeping husband became Tsar, Alexander III, and she, the girl from Copenhagen, became the Empress. The throne room of the Winter Palace was suffocating. It was filled with the scent of lilies and incense, a sweet, cloying smell that couldn't quite mask the metallic tang of blood that lingered in the building. Maria Feodorovna stood beside her husband, Sasha. As the highest officials of the Russian Empire filed past, one by one, to swear allegiance, she was the Empress. But this was not a coronation, it was an inquest. Her husband was not a new celebrated leader. He was a survivor, a man who had just inherited the world's most dangerous job. Sasha, now Tsar Alexander III, was 36 years old. He was a man in shock, his giant frame stooped with grief and a new terrible weight. The 12-year-old Nikki stood nearby, pale and terrified, having just seen his grandfather's shattered body. This was his first lesson in what it meant to be Tsar. It meant you would be hunted. Maria at 33 was the one who held them all together. Her grief was profound, but her will was stronger. In the days that followed, as the body of Alexander II lay in state, an atmosphere of sheer terror gripped St. Petersburg. The assassins of the people's will had not just killed a Tsar, they had sent a message. They had published an open letter declaring that the terror would not stop until Russia had a constitution. They promised that Alexander III and his family were next. This was not a government transition, it was a hostage crisis. Maria's fairy tale life at the Anichkov Palace, with its glittering balls and social triumphs, was over. The palace was now seen for what it was, a death trap, sitting on a public square, vulnerable to any assassin with a bomb. The family was immediately moved, under heavy guard, to the Winter Palace, but even its 1,000 rooms offered no safety. The new Tsar and his family were prisoners in their own capital, in the first frantic days of his reign. Alexander III was faced with a choice that would define the rest of the 19th century. His father, Alexander II, had been on the verge of signing a new reform, the Loris-Melikov Constitution, a document that would have created a consultative assembly, the very first tentative step toward a constitutional monarchy. It was lying on his desk the day he was murdered. The reformers in the government pleaded with the new Tsar, honor your father, sign the document, appease the people, show them that violence is not the answer. But another voice, a darker, more powerful voice, rose above the rest. It belonged to Konstantin Pobedonosov, the new Tsar's former tutor and the head of the Holy Synod. Pobedonosov was a man of fierce intellect and zero tolerance. He saw liberalism as a poison, democracy as a disease, and constitutions as the work of the devil. He stormed into the palace and confronted the grieving, uncertain Tsar. He pointed to the bloodstains. This, he argued, is the price of your father's weakness. This is the fruit of reform. They gave your father a free press, and it taught them how to kill. They gave him liberal education, and it created assassins. You must not yield. You must crush them. You must be an autocrat. You must be the iron fist of God. For Maria Feodorovna, watching her terrified husband and her pale son, there was no choice at all. Her father-in-law, the liberator, was dead. He had been liberal, and in return they had blown him to pieces. Her husband and her children would not suffer the same fate. The charming, vivacious, Western-educated Tsarevna was gone. In her place was the Empress of Russia, a woman hardened by terror. She threw her entire formidable weight behind Pobedonosov. She, who had come from the constitutional monarchy of Denmark, now became the most passionate defender of absolute divine right, autocracy. There would be no constitution, there would be no reform, there would be only order, held in place by the army and the secret police. Sasha, who adored his wife and trusted her instincts, agreed the Loris-Melikov Constitution was torn up. The manifesto of Alexander III's reign was published, drafted by Pobedonosov. It was called the Manifesto on Unshakable Autocracy. The message was clear. The new Tsar would not bend. He would rule Russia with an iron hand. The hunt for the assassins began. The Okhrana, a new, terrifyingly efficient secret police, was formed. The press was censored. Universities were put under state control. The brief spring of Alexander II's Russia was over. A new frozen winter had begun, but first the family had to be secured. They couldn't stay in St. Petersburg. It was too dangerous. The anarchists were everywhere. Maria, now terrified for her children, insisted they leave the city. The family packed their bags and retreated, not to a palace, but to a fortress. They moved 30 miles outside the city to the Gatchina palace. Gatchina was not a home, it was a statement. It was a massive 700-room stone behemoth built by Catherine the Great for her lover, and later converted into a military barracks by the paranoid Tsar Paul I. It was surrounded by watchtowers, moats, and artillery positions. It was, in short, the most secure, most depressing, and most unroyal residence in the entire empire. And this is where Maria Feodorovna, the most fashionable woman in Europe, would spend the next 13 years of her life. The move was a profound psychological shock. The Angel of Russia was now living in a gilded prison. Her children, who had been raised in the relative freedom of the Anichkov, were now prisoners with her Nikki, George, Zania, Misha, and Olga grew up in a world of suffocating security. They were not allowed to play in the public parks. They were rarely allowed into the city. Their only playmates were the children of the palace guards. Their life at Gatchina was a bizarre contradiction. On the one hand, Sasha and Maria insisted on a simple, almost bourgeois, private life. The children slept on army cots, took cold baths, and ate simple food. Sasha himself lived in a small suite of rooms, his office plain, his uniform old and patched. He liked to go out in the grounds and chop wood like a peasant, but this simplicity was housed within a fortress. Every door was locked, every corridor was patrolled, every visitor was searched. Spies were everywhere. The Tsar was so paranoid that he had a private kitchen, and all his food was tasted not just for poison, but often cooked in front of him. This was Maria's new reality. She, who had lived for the thrill of the crowd, was now isolated. She, who had been the center of St. Petersburg society, was now a hostess in a cage. But Maria Feodorovna was not the type to simply surrender to depression. If she was a prisoner, she would be the most glamorous prisoner in the world. She created a dual life. In private, at Gatchina, she was Minnie, the devoted wife and mother. Her marriage to Sasha, forged in grief and now tempered by fear, became one of the great royal love stories of the era. He was completely, utterly, and faithfully devoted to her. He, the Bear of Russia, was putty in her small hands. She was the only person who could manage his gruff moods, the only person whose political advice he truly trusted. "Minnie is my good angel," he wrote. She was the boss of the household, and he was the boss of the empire, and they never stepped on each other's toes. Their letters are filled with a simple domestic affection. He called her "my own darling little Minnie," and she called him "my angel Sasha." This was the anchor of her life. But then there was the other Maria, the public empress. Periodically, the family would move to the Winter Palace for the official St. Petersburg season. This was not for pleasure. It was for politics. It was a show of strength. Maria knew that the world and Russia could not see the autocracy hiding. They had to be shown that the Tsar was in charge, that the empire was stable, and that the glamour was undiminished. And Maria Feodorovna was the glamour. When the doors of the Winter Palace ballroom were thrown open, the woman who emerged was not the frugal Danish princess. She was a figure of overwhelming, breathtaking opulence. Tiny, yes, but encrusted from head to toe in the historic Romanov jewels, the massive sapphires, the ropes of pearls, the blinding diamond kokoshniks. Her gowns, made by the House of Worth in Paris, were the most expensive in the world. She was the undisputed arbiter of European style. What Maria wore, every other queen and princess in Europe, including her sister Alex, would copy. She was a brilliant dancer, and she would lead the polonaise, often dancing until 4 a.m., while her giant, gruff husband looked on with adoration, content to let her shine. This was her contribution to the autocracy. Sasha provided the iron fist. She provided the velvet glove. It was for her that the most famous symbols of Romanov luxury were created. In 1885, Sasha, knowing her love for beautiful things, wanted to give her an Easter gift. He commissioned the jeweler Peter Carl Fabergé to create a surprise. The result was the first Fabergé egg on the outside. It looked like a simple white enameled hen's egg, but it twisted open. Inside was a golden yolk. That in turn opened to reveal a perfect, tiny golden hen. And inside the hen was a miniature replica of the imperial crown and a tiny ruby egg. Maria was so enchanted by this object, this perfect, useless, incredibly expensive symbol of private love, that it became a tradition. Every single year, Fabergé would create a new, more elaborate egg for her. These eggs, which today are synonymous with the tragic doomed wealth of the Romanovs, were her tradition. They were a gift from her adoring husband, a small, perfect world of beauty to distract her from the ugly, terrifying world outside the palace walls. But her life was not just about jewels and eggs. She was a serious and very powerful political force. She was the Minister of Foreign Affairs in the bedroom, and she had two great political passions. She hated Germany, and she loved France and England. Her hatred of Germany was primal. It was born in her childhood, in 1864, when Prussia, led by Otto von Bismarck, had teamed up with Austria to invade Denmark and brutally annex the territories of Schleswig-Holstein. It was a national humiliation for Denmark, and Maria, her father's favorite, never, ever forgot it. She saw Prussia and the new unified German Empire as a nation of arrogant, militaristic bullies. She despised Bismarck, and she personally loathed the new, young, bombastic Kaiser, Wilhelm II. She called him that arrogant, stupid boy and did everything in her power to undermine his influence. While her husband, Sasha, was German on his father's side, he shared his wife's suspicions. Maria, with her constant, intimate, and coded letters to her sister Alex, the Princess of Wales, created a powerful personal back channel between the Russian and British courts. Her greatest diplomatic triumph, however, was France. For decades, Russia and France had been rivals. Maria saw the rising power of Germany and knew Russia needed a new ally. She, more than any diplomat, was the architect of the Franco-Russian alliance. She charmed French diplomats, championed French culture, and pushed relentlessly for a treaty in 1891 when the French fleet visited the Russian port of Kronstadt. It was a sensation. The mighty autocratic Tsar Alexander III, standing on the deck of a French warship, shocked the world by ordering the band to play La Marseillaise, the revolutionary anthem that was banned in his own country. He stood, his hat removed in respect, as the song of liberty, equality, fraternity rang out. The gesture, orchestrated by his wife, was a clear message to the world, and especially to Germany. Russia had a new friend. This 13-year reign, from 1881 to 1894, was the height of Maria's life. She was at the peak of her power, her beauty, and her influence. Her husband was the most powerful man on earth, and he adored her. Her son Nicky was the heir, and he was her little soul. Her sister was the future Queen of England. She had it all. But the cracks were already there. Her fortress-like existence had kept her children safe from bombs, but it had not prepared them for the world. Nicky, her beloved heir, was the center of this. He was a kind, gentle, and decent young man. He was, in short, a disaster waiting to happen. He had been raised by his mother to be a polite, charming gentleman, and by his father and Pobedonostsev to be a ruthless, iron-willed autocrat. The two things were incompatible. He had the manners of an English lord, but the political mindset of a 17th century king. He was, as one minister famously said, unfit to run a post office. Maria, in her possessive, adoring love, was blind to this, or perhaps she refused to see it. He was her Nicky. He was perfect. Any weakness she perceived she attributed to his youth, she would guide him. Then a new tragedy struck, a cruel echo of her past. Her second son, George, a tall, handsome, and much more robust boy than Nicky, had been his brother's constant companion. But in 1891, he was diagnosed with tuberculosis, the same disease that had stolen her first fiancé, Nixa. Maria was frantic. She sent him to the Caucasus, to the warm, dry air, hoping for a miracle, but it was a death sentence. George was exiled from the family, living as an invalid, slowly wasting away just as Nixa had. It was another great sorrow, another shadow that fell over the family. And then, in 1894, the unthinkable happened. The man she thought was invincible, her protector, her giant, her beloved Sasha, fell ill. It started as nothing. He was 49, a mountain of a man, the picture of health. But he began complaining of back pain. He lost weight. His face became puffy. The doctors were baffled. Finally, a specialist was called from Berlin. The diagnosis was a thunderbolt, nephritis, a fatal kidney disease. There was no cure. Maria was in a state of total hysterical denial. She refused to believe it. Her Sasha, ill, impossible. He was the strongest man in the world. She accused the doctors of incompetence. But as the months wore on, she was forced to watch in horror as her husband, the man who had bent iron bars, wasted away before her eyes, just as Nixa had. The family raced to their palace in Levadia, in the Crimea, the same place she would one day be a prisoner. They hoped the warm air and the sea breeze would help. It didn't. By the autumn of 1894, the entire imperial family had gathered for another death vigil. Maria Feodorovna, who had entered this family at the deathbed of Nixa, was now at the deathbed of his brother, her husband. She rarely left his side. For weeks she nursed him, prayed, and raged against fate. But he was slipping away. And as the Tsar lay dying, a new, desperate political problem arose. Her son Nicky, the 26-year-old heir, was not just unprepared. He was unmarried. And he was in love with a woman Maria despised. He was in love with Princess Alex of Hesse. A German Maria had fought the match for years. She found the girl shy, cold, and awkward. And she was German, from the one country Maria hated most. She had tried to marry Nicky off to a French princess, anyone but Alex. But Nicky, in his one great act of quiet rebellion, had refused. Now, with Sasha dying, the need for an heir and a married heir was desperate. Nicky pleaded with his mother. This was his only love. Sasha, from his deathbed, gave his blessing. "Marry her," he wheezed. "It is the right thing." Maria, trapped, was forced to relent. She telegraphed the young German princess, who she had previously snubbed, and summoned her to the Crimea. "Come at once," the message said. "Sasha is dying." Princess Alex of Hesse raced across Europe and arrived at Levadia. She walked into a house of mourning, a stranger, to meet her future mother-in-law, a woman who already hated her. For a few days, the three of them were trapped in this unbearable, tragic triangle. Maria, consumed with nursing her dying husband Nicky, torn between his grief for his father and his love for his fiancée, and Alex, a terrified, out-of-place girl, watching the family she was about to join collapse. The world that Maria Feodorovna had known ended on November 1st, 1894, in a quiet bedroom in the Levadia Palace. Her husband, her rock, her giant Sasha was gone. The iron force that had held the Russian Empire together for 13 years by sheer unbending will had vanished, and in his place was her son, Nicholas. The scene in the palace was one of pure, unrestrained grief. Maria, 46 years old but looking like a shattered old woman, threw herself onto her husband's body, wailing, "My angel, my Sasha!" She refused to be moved, clinging to the cooling body as if her love alone could reanimate it. And through this fog of despair, her son, the new Tsar of all the Russias, wept in a corridor. "I am not prepared," he had cried. "I know nothing of the business of ruling." Maria knew, with the terrible piercing clarity of a mother, that he was right. He was a 26-year-old man, but in matters of state he was a boy. He was kind, he was gentle, he was a loving son, all the qualities that made him a wonderful human being and a catastrophic autocrat. Her husband, Sasha, in a fatal act of overprotection, had kept Nicky from the real business of government. Just as he had been kept from it, he was trained to salute, to review troops, and to be a gentleman, not to rule 1/6 of the world. And in that moment of supreme crisis, as the empire's fate rested on her son's weak shoulders, Nicholas made his first decision as Tsar. It was not a political decision. It was not a military decision. It was a romantic one. And for Maria, it was the first and deepest betrayal. He declared that he would marry his fiancée, Princess Alex of Hesse, immediately. Maria was appalled. They were in the Crimea. His father's body was not yet cold. The long, sacred 1,000-mile funeral procession back to St. Petersburg had not even begun. In the Orthodox faith, and by all standards of royal decency, to marry during a period of deep mourning, especially before the previous Tsar was even in his tomb, was unthinkable. It was beyond disrespectful. It was, in her eyes, a sacrilege. She argued with him, she pleaded, she commanded. "It is not proper," she insisted. "The people will not understand. It is a terrible omen." But for the first time in his life, poor, weak-willed Nicky was unmovable. He was terrified. He was a drowning man, and this shy German girl was his only life raft. He could not face the ordeal of the funeral, the journey to St. Petersburg, and the weight of the crown alone. He needed her. He wrote in his diary, "I am in tears, but I feel my beloved Alex is here, and she will be my helper." Maria saw it differently. It was not her son making a decision. It was that woman, that German girl who had arrived in the house of death, was already exerting her cold foreign influence, pulling her son away from his mother and his sacred duty. The battle lines were drawn right there over Alexander III's coffin. Maria lost. The long, grim journey north began. It was the strangest procession in Russian history. A funeral train, draped in black, slowly carried the colossal casket of the dead Tsar. And in the very same train, in a different carriage, sat the new Tsar and his giggling, whispering fiancée. While Maria and her children were shrouded in black crape and suffocating grief, Nicky and Alex were, for the first time, blissfully, inappropriately happy, planning their new life to Maria. It was a grotesque spectacle. When they arrived in St. Petersburg, Alex was rushed through her Orthodox conversion. She took the name Alexandra Feodorovna. The funeral of Alexander III was a massive, somber, and magnificent event. The nation mourned the peacemaker, and then, exactly 1 week after her husband was laid to rest, Maria Feodorovna was forced to attend her son's wedding. It was the quietest, most indecent royal wedding imaginable. It took place on November 26, 1894, which was Maria's own 47th birthday, a detail that felt like a deliberate, cruel twist of the knife. There was no ball. There was no celebration. The court was still in official mourning. The bride, Alexandra, wore a standard court gown, but she did not wear a white wedding dress. She was, as she later wrote, a bride and a funeral mourner at the same time. As Maria stood in the chapel in her heavy black mourning dress, watching her son marry the German princess, she felt a chill. The only person smiling was her son. The bride was weeping, not from joy, but from stress and terror. The entire court was whispering. One guest, a Grand Duke, famously remarked, "The wedding felt like a continuation of the funeral. It was a terrible omen." For Maria, the omen was already a reality. Her son had been stolen. Now began the greatest, most catastrophic, and most personal conflict of Nicholas II's reign, the war between the two empresses. By all laws of nature and court, Maria, as the Dowager Empress, should have taken a step back. She should have yielded the stage to the new young Empress, Alexandra. But Maria Feodorovna was not a woman who yielded. She had been the social and political center of Russia for 28 years. She was the beloved angel of Russia. She was not about to disappear into a quiet retirement in a dower house. And protocol was on her side. Russian court law, which Maria knew by heart, dictated that the Dowager Empress held precedence over the new Empress. This was not a small detail. This was everything. It meant that at every state dinner, every grand ball, every public ceremony, it was Maria, not Alexandra, who entered on the arm of the new Tsar. It was Maria who took the place of honor. It was Maria who led the first dance. Alexandra, the actual reigning empress, was forced to walk behind her, often on the arm of a lesser Grand Duke. It was a public, daily, and exquisitely painful humiliation. And Maria insisted on it. She justified this to herself and to her family with perfect logic. She was not just a widow, she was the empress. The title was for life. She had earned it. She was the one the people loved. She was the one who knew how to behave. This new girl, this German woman, was shy, awkward, and cold. She didn't speak Russian well. She didn't know the customs. She hated the parties. If Maria stepped back, the glamour of the autocracy, the very thing she and Sasha had rebuilt, would collapse. She was not doing it to be cruel. She was doing it to save the dynasty. Or so she told herself. The truth was, it was a battle for her son Alexandra, humiliated in public, fought back in the only place she could, in private. She created a cocoon around Nicholas. She pulled him away from his frivolous and worldly mother. She emphasized her own piety, her own seriousness. She made their private apartments a shrine to their own perfect family life, a fortress against the court that had rejected her. The entire Russian aristocracy was forced to choose a side, and they chose, overwhelmingly, the mother's party. Maria's court, at her own Anichkov Palace, remained the true center of St. Petersburg society. It was glittering, fashionable, and fun. It was filled with laughter, music, and French wit. This is where the power brokers, the ministers, and the ambassadors went. Alexandra's court, at the Alexander Palace in Tsarskoye Selo, was a pariah state. It was quiet, pious, and, in a word, German. It was isolated, staffed by a small, strange clique of devoted sycophants and mystics. Alexandra hated the fast St. Petersburg set, and they hated her right back. She famously complained, "The society of St. Petersburg is a sewer." Nicholas was trapped in the middle. He was, as one courtier noted, a devoted son and a devoted husband. He loved his mother, and he adored his wife. He was constitutionally incapable of confronting either of them, so he simply tried to manage their war, which only made it worse. This bitter family drama was not just society gossip. It was a political catastrophe. It isolated the new Tsar and his wife from their own aristocracy, the very people they needed to help them rule. It created a vacuum of power, one that would soon be filled by a monstrous force. Then in May 1896, the first great disaster of the new reign struck. It was time for the official coronation in Moscow. It was the last great imperial spectacle Europe would ever see. For weeks, Moscow was a blaze of medieval glory. Maria Feodorovna was there, in her full, undiminished splendor. She sat on a secondary throne, watching as her son and his wife were crowned. She wept. She wrote, "For my beloved Sasha, who should have been here." The ceremonies were followed by a traditional celebration for the people, held at Kodinka Field, a massive, uneven military training ground on the outskirts of the city. The plan was to give out 500,000 coronation gifts, a commemorative mug, a sausage, a pretzel. 500,000 people showed up, but the field was a mess. It was crisscrossed with ditches and trenches. The police presence was laughably small. As the crowd surged forward, rumors spread that the beer and gifts were running out. A panic started. People fell into the ditches. A human wave, blind and terrified, pushed forward, trampling those who had fallen. It was a stampede of horrific proportions. When the dust cleared, at least 1,400 people were crushed to death. Thousands more were maimed. The field was a carpet of dead bodies. The news hit the palace like a cannonball. Nicholas was devastated. Alexandra was horrified. And Maria Feodorovna was furious. This was incompetence. This was a stain on the sacred coronation. This was a terrible sign from God. She insisted, along with other senior royals, that the new Tsar must immediately show his remorse. He must go to the hospitals. He must cancel all festivities. He must lead a national day of mourning. But there was a problem, a huge diplomatic problem. That very night, a grand opulent ball was scheduled to be held at the French embassy. It was the most important diplomatic event of the coronation, meant to cement the Franco-Russian alliance, the very alliance Maria herself had worked so hard to build. The French ambassador pleaded with the Tsar. "You cannot cancel," he argued. "It will be a diplomatic insult. It will destroy our alliance. The ball has been paid for. It is not your fault." Nicholas, trapped, made the single worst decision of his life. He listened to the French ambassador. He decided to go to the ball. That night, while the bodies of his subjects were still being carted away from Kodinka Field, Tsar Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra Feodorovna appeared at the French embassy. They were somber, yes. They only stayed a short while, but they went. The next day, the newspapers were brutal. The Tsar and his German wife are dancing while the people die. For Maria Feodorovna, this was the moment she knew in her bones that her son was doomed. Her Sasha would never have done this. He would have gone to the field himself, knelt in the dirt, and prayed with his people. He would have had the ambassador shot. This new reign, her son's reign, was cursed. It was cursed by weakness, and it was cursed by that cold, unfeeling German woman who had the heart of a foreigner. The wedge between mother and son, and between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, was now a chasm. The next crisis was biological. The entire purpose of the new empress was to produce an heir. The clock was ticking. In 1895, Alexandra gave birth. It was a girl, Olga, a lovely child. The court was pleased, but waiting. In 1897, she gave birth again, a girl, Tatiana, beautiful, but still not the heir. In 1899, she gave birth again, a girl, Maria. The anxiety was growing. In 1901, she gave birth again, a fourth girl, Anastasia. 4 daughters. It was a dynasty of women. Maria Feodorovna, who was a doting and loving grandmother, was in a state of quiet panic. Where was the Cesarevich? The empire must have a male heir. She had given her Sasha 2 sons almost immediately. This failure, too, was laid at Alexandra's feet. It was her cold blood, her German weakness. Alexandra, for her part, was not just anxious, she was hysterical. She was failing in her one essential duty. She was a failure as an empress and a failure as a wife. She became gaunt, her nerves shredded. She prayed for hours, her knees raw on the cold marble floor of her private chapel. And in her desperation, she opened the door to a new, strange, and dangerous world. She began to seek out holy men. She had always been a mystic. Her piety was genuine, but it was obsessive. Now she began to listen to charlatans. Her new best friends, a pair of Montenegrin princesses, introduced her to a holy man from France, a butcher's apprentice named Monsieur Philippe Vachot. He claimed he could, through prayer and spiritualism, guarantee her a son. He became a fixture in the palace. He held seances. He gave the empress potions. He claimed to have switched the sex of the baby in her womb. In 1902, Alexandra announced she was pregnant. The nation rejoiced. But months passed, and it became clear it was a phantom pregnancy, a hysterical delusion. When Maria Feodorovna found out about this, she was beyond furious. She was disgusted. This was not just embarrassing. It was a state security risk. She was a pragmatic high society woman. She hated this peasant superstition. She saw her son's wife not just as cold, but as mad. She confronted Nicky. "How can you allow this charlatan in your house? You are the Tsar of Russia. You are making a mockery of the crown. Banish him." Under his mother's relentless, furious pressure, Nicky finally relented. Monsieur Philippe was sent back to France. But the damage was done. Alexandra was more isolated than ever, and more desperate. And Maria had learned that her son's wife was capable of opening the palace gates to anyone she believed could help her. The dynasty was in crisis. A weak czar, a hated, hysterical empress, a court at war with itself, no male heir. And then Nicholas made his second great blunder. He decided to go to war. In 1904, tensions were rising in the East with the newly aggressive modernized Empire of Japan. Both wanted control of Manchuria and Korea. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, Maria's loathed nephew, was secretly goading his cousin Nicky into the fight, telling him it was Russia's holy destiny to rule Asia. Maria Feodorovna was vehemently, violently opposed. She was her husband's widow. Sasha had been the Tsar peacemaker. His motto was that Russia needed no new territory. It needed to be strong at home. She saw this war for what it was, a disastrous, unwinnable, and unnecessary adventure, stirred up by the German Kaiser to weaken Russia and distract it from Europe, she argued. She pleaded. She raged. Nicholas did not listen. He was surrounded by ministers who told him it would be a short, victorious war. A quick victory, they said, would boost patriotism and silence the growing revolutionary whispers. In February 1904, the Russo-Japanese War began. It was a catastrophe from the first day. The Japanese were modern, organized, and ruthless. The Russians were arrogant, disorganized, and using 50-year-old tactics. The army was slaughtered. The final humiliating blow came at the Battle of Tsushima in May 1905, when the entire Russian Baltic fleet, having sailed halfway around the world, was annihilated by the Japanese Navy. In a single afternoon, the short, victorious war had become the most humiliating defeat in Russian history. Maria was vindicated, and she was brokenhearted. She had spent the war, as she had in her youth, as a Red Cross nurse. She organized hospital trains, tore bandages, and wrote letters to wounded soldiers. She also watched as the country she loved began to disintegrate. The humiliation of the war lit a match to a powder keg. On January 22, 1905, back in St. Petersburg, a peaceful procession of workers, led by a priest, marched to the Winter Palace to petition the Tsar for better working conditions. They were carrying icons and singing, God Save the Tsar. They were met by troops who, in a moment of panic, opened fire. Hundreds of men, women, and children were shot down in the snow. It was Bloody Sunday, and it was the day the Russian people's sacred faith in their little father, the Tsar, died forever. The 1905 revolution had begun. The country exploded. Strikes paralyzed the cities. The navy mutinied. Assassins roamed the streets. Grand dukes were blown up in their carriages. It was 1881 all over again, but 1,000 times worse. Maria Feodorovna, who was in Denmark visiting her family when the worst of it began, raced back to Russia. She was not returning as a grieving widow. She was returning as the last defender of the dynasty. Her son was failing. She would not. She found Nicholas at his palace paralyzed with indecision. The regime was collapsing. His advisors, led by the brilliant statesman Sergei Witte, told him he had only two choices: a savage military dictatorship that would drown the country in blood, or a Constitution Nicholas. The man who had been raised to believe his autocratic power came from God was horrified. He would not give up his sacred power. It would be a betrayal of his father, Sasha. And here, Maria Feodorovna made the most difficult and most pragmatic decision of her life. She, the ultimate autocrat, the woman who had helped her husband tear up a constitution in 1881, now saw the writing on the wall. She hated the idea. It made her physically ill. But she hated the idea of her son losing his throne more. She, along with the rest of the Romanov family, cornered Nicholas. They told him he had no choice. The army was disloyal. The people were gone. "You must sign," she told him, "or sign it and save the throne." On October 30th, 1905, Nicholas II, his hand shaking, signed the October Manifesto. He granted Russia a constitution, a parliament, and civil rights. Autocracy was officially over. He went to his rooms and wept, feeling he had betrayed his father's sacred oath Maria had saved the dynasty, but she had been forced to sacrifice her husband's entire legacy to do it. In the fall of 1905, as the Russian Empire teetered on the brink of disintegration, two separate, competing Russias were at war. In one Russia, the public Russia, Maria Feodorovna, the pragmatist, had just forced her son to sign the October Manifesto. She had, she believed, narrowly saved the crown by sacrificing her husband's sacred principle of autocracy. She, along with statesmen like Sergei Witte, was now desperately trying to navigate the new treacherous world of a parliament and a constitutional monarchy, a system she personally despised but had accepted as a bitter medicine to save the patient. She was dealing with strikes, political reforms, and the fallout of a disastrous war. But in the other Russia, the private Russia, a different, far more potent force was at work. While Maria was looking at political maps, her daughter-in-law, Empress Alexandra, was looking at her son, and her son was dying. The hemophilia of the Tsarevich Alexei was the one catastrophic secret that changed the course of history. It was the wound that, if revealed, would destroy the dynasty. An heir who could die from a simple nosebleed was no heir at all. Alexandra, therefore, was not just a mother. She was the guardian of a state secret, and she was living in a state of permanent, screaming terror. And it was into this vortex of terror and secrecy that Grigory Rasputin walked. He was introduced in November 1905, just a month after the manifesto. He was not a sophisticated charlatan like the Frenchman, Monsieur Philippe. He was a mujik, a peasant from the depths of Siberia. He was dirty. He smelled. He had matted hair, a hypnotic stare, and he treated the Tsar and Tsarina not as gods, but as fellow, flawed human beings. To Alexandra, this was a revelation he wasn't a courtier. He was a real man of God. Maria Feodorovna, when she first heard of him, dismissed him. It was just another of the German woman's strange mystical hobbies. It was embarrassing, but it was a private matter. She was too busy trying to hold the country together. Then came the miracles. Alexei was a prisoner of his disease. He was constantly in pain, his joints swollen with internal bleeding. The doctors, with their newfangled medicines, were helpless. One day, the boy had a bleeding episode. He was in agony. The doctors were in a panic. Alexandra, in her desperation, did the one thing she had been told to do. She sent for the starets. Rasputin arrived. He was not a doctor. He was not a priest. He walked into the boy's opulent bedroom, a dirty peasant in a palace of gold. He looked at the child, made the sign of the cross, and perhaps laid his hands on him. He spoke in a low, calm, hypnotic voice. "It is nothing," he told the boys. "Go to sleep. The pain will pass." And, to the astonishment of everyone, the bleeding stopped. The boy, who had been writhing in agony, fell into a calm, peaceful sleep. How? We will never know for sure. Was it a hypnotic suggestion that calmed the boy and lowered his blood pressure? Was it, as some historians argue, his peasant wisdom that told the doctors to stop giving the boy the aspirin that was killing him? Or was it, as Alexandra believed with all the fervor of a zealot, a miracle from God? It didn't matter. From that moment, Rasputin was not just a holy man. He was the savior. He was, in Alexandra's mind, the only thing standing between her son and death. He became untouchable. For Maria Feodorovna, this was no longer a hobby. This was an infestation. The stories began to trickle out, and they were horrifying. This holy man was a lecher. He was a drunkard. He was a notorious womanizer. The secret police, the Okhrana, began to follow him, and their reports, which were delivered in secret to the Dowager Empress, were stomach-churning. They described Rasputin's nights of debauchery. He would go to the finest restaurants in St. Petersburg, get roaring drunk, and boast to the entire room, "I have the Tsar in my pocket, and the Tsarina is my..." He was seen in bathhouses with prostitutes. He was seducing the wives of aristocrats, telling them that to sin with him was a holy act, and this creature had a private, unchecked, 24-hour access to the palace. He was calling the Empress Mama. He was calling the Tsar Papa. He was, most horrifyingly, seen entering the nurseries of the Grand Duchesses, Maria's granddaughters, when they were in their nightgowns, to say prayers with them. For Maria Feodorovna, the elegant, Victorian, and fiercely protective matriarch, this was a moral horror beyond comprehension. It was not just a political crisis. It was a stain. It was a disgrace. It was filth. Her son, the Tsar of all the Russias, the heir to her beloved Sasha, was allowing a lecherous, drunken, syphilitic peasant to defile the sanctity of the imperial family. She tried to rationalize it. She tried to believe the reports were exaggerated, but the gossip was too loud. It was no longer just in the drawing rooms of St. Petersburg. It was in the gutters. It was in the international newspapers. The French press, her beloved allies, were running cartoons. The German press, her hated enemies, were mocking her son's weakness. The shame was unbearable. She, who had been the most glamorous and respected empress in the world, was now the mother-in-law of a mad woman and the mother of a fool. The time for subtlety was over. Maria Feodorovna, who had retired from politics after the 1905 manifesto, now returned to the fight. She went to Tsarskoye Selo, to the Alexander Palace, the insular, pious, and hated home of her son and daughter-in-law. She was going to confront her son. We can only imagine the scene. The Dowager Empress, tiny, ramrod straight, dressed in her impeccable, severe black mourning clothes, sweeping into the palace, her face a mask of cold fury. She bypassed Alexandra. She would not even look at her. She demanded to see the Tsar. Alone Nicky, her poor, weak-willed Nicky, was trapped. He could not defy his mother, but he could not defy his wife. "You must banish him," Maria would have said, her voice shaking with a rage that was equal parts political and personal. "He is destroying you. He is destroying the dynasty. He is destroying the memory of your father." "Mama," Nicholas would have pleaded, "you do not understand. He is a man of God. He is our only friend. When he is here, Alexei is well. When he is gone, he bleeds. Do you want my son to die? He is a charlatan," she would have screamed. "He is a Clist, a heretic. He is a tool of the devil. He is laughing at you. The whole world is laughing at you. Your own daughters, Nicky. He is in their rooms. How can you allow it?" "It is not true," Nicholas would have insisted, retreating into his weak, stubborn denial. "It is all slander. The world is cruel. They do not understand. He is a simple man of God. Alexandra, she knows. God speaks to her." And in that moment, Maria Feodorovna looked at her son and realized the truth. He was lost. She had been defeated. She, who had faced down assassins and forced her son to sign a constitution, was beaten by a dirty peasant, the German woman, and her demon had won. She left the palace, and the rift, which had been a chasm, now became an ocean. Maria was not the only one. The entire Romanov family was in open revolt. The Grand Dukes, the uncles and cousins of the Tsar, the giant, bearded, often terrifying men who were the pillars of the dynasty, were apoplectic. This was not just a family matter. It was their throne, their legacy, their money, their lives that Rasputin was destroying. They tried to intervene. Grand Duke Nicholas, the commander of the army, a man his father Sasha had respected, confronted the Tsar. He was dismissed. Maria's own sister-in-law, the Grand Duchess Elizabeth, a woman who had become a saintly nun after her husband was assassinated, went to Alexandra and pleaded with her to banish Rasputin. Alexandra, in a cold fury, accused her own sister of betraying her. Elizabeth left, weeping, and said she is doomed. Maria's own children were just as horrified. Her daughters Zania and Olga and her son Misha all tried to talk to their brother Nicky. He would not listen. He wrote in his diary, "My mother and my sisters are attacking me again. They must not listen to gossip." The family was broken. The schism was complete. It was now officially Nicholas and Alexandra against the entire Romanov clan and the entire Russian aristocracy. And Maria Feodorovna could not bear to watch it. She could not stay in St. Petersburg, the city that had been her stage, and watch this grotesque, tragic farce play out. She could not attend court functions and be forced to see the empty chair where her daughter-in-law should have been, knowing that Alexandra was instead at home taking advice from a peasant. So Maria Feodorovna, in a final act of protest and self-preservation, left. She retired. She moved, in effect, to Kiev. It was a symbolic and powerful choice. Kiev was the ancient, holy Russian heart of the Orthodox faith. It was not the new Western St. Petersburg. She established her own court at the Mariinsky Palace in Kiev. She was, in effect, a shadow empress. The aristocracy, the politicians, and the military leaders who had been disgusted by Rasputin now had a new capital. They flocked to Kiev. When they wanted to deal with the real Russia, the sane Russia, they went to see the Dowager Empress. When they had to deal with the mad Russia, they went reluctantly to St. Petersburg. For the last years before the collapse, roughly 1915 to early 1917, Maria lived mostly in Kiev, surrounded by her own government, running her vast Red Cross organization, and writing constant, agonized, pleading letters to her son. "My dearest Nicky, I am in despair. I hear the most terrible things. Banish him. For the love of God, for the love of your father, act." Nicky's replies were polite, loving, and completely dismissive. "My darling Mama, do not worry so much. All is well. God is with us." Maria's one ray of light, her one connection to a sane world, was her sister, Alex, in England. Their letters, flying between Kiev and London, were her lifeline. They were two matriarchs now, two empresses, complaining about their children, their governments, and most of all their shared, hated nephew, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. And in June 1914, that hated nephew's world, and their world, was about to set itself on fire. When the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo, Maria Feodorovna, the seasoned political operator, knew exactly what this meant. She knew her loathed Kaiser would use this as an excuse to start the war he had always wanted. She was in London, visiting Alex when the news broke. She had to race back to Russia, getting out of Germany on one of the last trains, just hours before war was declared. She was, she said, treated like a spy by the Germans. Her hatred, which was already profound, became absolute. When Russia mobilized, she, like the rest of the country, was swept up in a wave of patriotic fervor. This was not a disastrous colonial war like the one with Japan. This was a holy war. This was a war against the Germans. She returned to St. Petersburg and threw herself at 67 years old into the war effort. She was once again the Angel of Russia. She became the head of the entire Russian Red Cross. She organized hospital trains, funded field hospitals, and, like her mother-in-law before her, tore bandages with her own hands. She was a symbol of national unity, of sacrifice, of Russian duty, and in doing so she became the perfect, shining public foil to her daughter-in-law because Alexandra was, in a word, German. This was the final fatal nail in Alexandra's coffin. As Russian soldiers were being slaughtered by German machine guns, the woman on the throne was a German rumors, which were completely false but unstoppable, spread like fire. The Empress is a spy. She has a secret telephone line to her cousin, the Kaiser. She is deliberately sabotaging the war effort. The fact that Alexandra was also a patriot, that she also trained as a Red Cross nurse and scrubbed floors and held the hands of dying, maggot-infested soldiers, didn't matter. She was German Maria, the Danish Empress, who was famously, publicly, and vocally anti-German, became the only empress the people, the army, and the aristocracy trusted Rasputin for his part had been against the war. It was the one single, sane piece of advice he ever gave. He knew it would be the end, but now, with the war raging, his power became even more absolute and more sinister. In September 1915, Nicholas made the single most catastrophic decision of his reign. The army was failing. The generals were incompetent. Nicholas, who had been raised on stories of his father, Sasha, the soldier czar, believed it was his sacred duty to lead. He announced that he was leaving the capital, going to the front lines at Mogilev, and taking personal command of the entire Russian military. He was not a general. He had no military experience. He was, as one of his ministers said, leaving a post office to run an empire. The entire government and his mother were united in their horror. This was not just a bad idea, it was suicide. Maria Feodorovna got on a train and raced from Kiev to Petrograd. She met her son in what was to be their last great and most terrible confrontation. She begged him, she commanded him, she wept. "Nicky, you cannot do this. You are not a soldier. You are the Tsar. Your place is here, in the capital, governing your people. It is my duty, Mama, he said stubbornly. I will lead my men to victory. You are a fool, she must have screamed. If you go, you are leaving the empire in her hands, in the hands of a hysterical woman. And here she went for the kill. Do not do this. If you do this, you are choosing. You are choosing her and her demon over your country and over your mother. Nicholas looked at his mother, and he chose. He left for the front. And as he left, he wrote a letter officially to his wife. He left Empress Alexandra Feodorovna in charge of the government. He made her his regent. Maria Feodorovna had just witnessed the abdication, not the abdication of 1917, but the real abdication. Nicholas had just handed the crown of Peter the Great, the crown of her beloved Sasha, to his German wife. And Maria knew who was really in charge of his German wife. The Russian government was now in the hands of Rasputin. The final dark act of the tragedy had begun. Maria, defeated and heartbroken, retreated to Kiev. She wrote to her daughter, I'm in despair, my poor Nicky. He is a good, kind soul, but he is a weak-willed child. He has been captured. And now Russia will pay. She was right. The period known as the Rasputinshina, or the Rasputin times, had begun, and it would end in blood. The winter of 1916 was the darkest in Russia's history. The war was no longer a patriotic cause. It was a vast, frozen, open-air slaughterhouse. At the front, millions of Russian men, ill-equipped, ill-fed, and led by incompetent generals, were being scythed down by German machine guns. The trenches were filled with bodies, typhus, and a deep, simmering, mutinous rage. And in the capital, Petrograd, it was worse. The city was starving. There was no bread. There was no fuel. Women and children were freezing to death in their apartments, their faces blue with cold. And in the Alexander Palace, the government was being run by a madman. This was the Rasputinshina. The Empress Alexandra, her face gaunt, her eyes burning with a zealot's fire, was in charge, and her prime minister, her only advisor, was Grigory Rasputin. The government of a 200 million-person empire was now being decided in Rasputin's squalid, filthy apartment. Ambitious and often idiotic politicians would go to him, bow, and beg for a job. He would hold court, drunk, surrounded by prostitutes and sycophants. If he liked a man, he would tell Mama to appoint him. If he didn't, the man was fired. It became known with grim hysterical humor as the ministerial leapfrog. In the space of 1 year, Russia had 4 prime ministers, 4 ministers of the interior, and 3 ministers of war. Talented statesmen were dismissed because Rasputin had a bad feeling about them. Incompetent fools were put in charge of the army or the food supply because they had paid Rasputin's secretary a bribe. The country was not just bleeding at the front, it was rotting from the head. And in Kiev, 500 miles away, Maria Feodorovna sat and watched in a state of impotent, seething, and ice-cold fury. She was no longer just a mother. She was a monarch in exile. Her palace in Kiev had become the shadow capital, the sane Russia. She was 69 years old, but her energy was terrifying. Her days were a blur of activity. She was the head of the entire Red Cross for the Southern Front. She toured hospitals. She organized aid. She wrote thousands of letters by hand to wounded soldiers. The army, which despised the German woman in Petrograd, adored the Dowager Empress. She was their little mother, their angel. But her nights were filled with dread. Her office was the wailing wall for every sane man left in the regime. Politicians, generals, and aristocrats, having been fired by Alexandra or disgusted by Rasputin, would make the pilgrimage to Kiev. They would sit with Maria in her study, and they would beg her to do something. Your Majesty, the country is collapsing. Your Majesty, the Empress is leading us to ruin. Your Majesty, this peasant will destroy the throne. You are the only one she will listen to. You must save us. What could she do? She was living on a diet of terrible, terrifying reports from her allies in the secret police. She knew everything. She knew about the orgies. She knew about the bribes. She knew that Rasputin had, in a drunken stupor, boasted of his power over the Empress, and disgustingly of his friendship with her granddaughters. She wrote to her son Nicholas at the front. Her letters, which had once been the pleading, loving notes of Mama, were now the desperate, furious commands of an empress. My dearest Nicky, she wrote, in a letter that drips with her controlled rage. I feel that you are on the edge of an abyss and that you are pulling your country down with you. How can it be that this creature is still at large? He is a false prophet, a demon. You are allowing him to defile the memory of your father. She told him of a terrifying vision she had. I saw your father, my beloved Sasha. He was in his study, and he pointed to you, and he said, my poor son, he is destroying my life's work. Nicky's replies when they came were heartbreaking in their delusion. My darling Mama, do not listen to this slander. We are all so weary of this gossip. If you only knew what a good, holy man Grigory is, he is our only friend. He prays for us, and for Alexei, and for Russia. He was lost. She knew it. By the autumn of 1916, the entire Romanov family, the vast sprawling clan of Grand Dukes and Duchesses, knew it too. This was no longer about Nicholas. This was about them. They saw their own execution warrants being written. They saw the end of the dynasty. They decided to make one final collective stand. At a family council, they drafted a letter, an ultimatum to the Tsar. They bypassed Alexandra completely. They begged him, as a family, to banish Rasputin and his wife from all power, to return to the capital, and to install a government of national confidence. Nicholas's response was ice cold. He was the autocrat. He would not be told how to rule by his family. He rejected their plea. He called them traitors who were listening to drawing room gossip. This was the final fatal break. The Tsar had just declared war on his own family, and the family decided to act. If the Tsar was too weak, too bewitched, to remove the demon who was destroying Russia, then they would. This was not a murder. This was an exorcism. The conspiracy was born not in the streets, but in the most exclusive aristocratic drawing rooms of Petrograd. And the leader was a man who was, in effect, Maria Feodorovna's own family. His name was Prince Felix Yusupov. He was the richest man in Russia, an eccentric, dazzling, and beautiful aristocrat. And he was married to Princess Irina, the daughter of Maria's own eldest daughter, Xenia. Felix was, in short, Maria's grandson-in-law. Felix, in his memoirs, describes the moral horror he saw the rot. He saw the shame, and he saw his beloved country and his wife's family being dragged into the abyss by one filthy, hypnotic peasant. He was joined by two others, Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, Nicholas's first cousin, a dashing young man who was like a son to the Tsar, and Vladimir Purishkevich, a fiery right-wing politician in the Duma who hated Rasputin with a biblical passion. This was not a Bolshevik plot. This was the ultimate loyalist plot. These were the last patriots. They were not killing a man to overthrow the Tsar. They were killing a man to save the Tsar. The plot was pure Gothic melodrama. Felix, who had gained Rasputin's trust, would lure the Starets to his own Moika palace. He would tell Rasputin that his wife, Irina, wanted to meet him. On the night of December 30th, 1916, it happened. Felix brought Rasputin to a lavishly prepared cellar room. He fed him sweet cakes laced with enough potassium cyanide to kill an elephant. Rasputin ate them. Nothing happened. Felix, in a panic, gave him glasses of poisoned wine. Rasputin drank them. Nothing happened. The peasant, with his supernatural power, just sat there, laughing. Felix, in a state of terror, ran upstairs. "He will not die," he told his co-conspirators. They gave him a revolver. Felix went back down. He talked to Rasputin, and then he shot him in the chest. Rasputin fell, and the men, believing him dead, prepared to move the body. But as Felix checked the pulse, the corpse opened its eyes. Rasputin, roaring like a wounded animal, leaped to his feet, grabbed Felix, and tried to strangle him all while clawing at his epaulets. The other conspirators, hearing the screams, rushed in. Rasputin, bleeding, broke free and ran out into the snowy courtyard screaming, "I will tell the Empress." Purishkevich, the politician, chased him, firing his own gun, missing, and then finally hitting him twice in the back. Rasputin fell into a snowbank. The men, now in a state of primal animal terror, gathered around the body. It was still moving. They grabbed a heavy club and, in a fit of savage, terrified rage, beat him into silence. They wrapped the body, drove it to the Neva River, and threw it through a hole in the ice. The demon was dead. The news spread through Petrograd like electricity. Rasputin had disappeared. In Kiev, Maria Feodorovna received the telegram. She was in her palace, surrounded by her staff. She read the coded message. Her lady-in-waiting, watching her, saw the Empress for the first time in 2 years smile. Maria's reaction was not one of shock or horror or even officially of approval. It was one of pure, unadulterated, and triumphant relief. She did not say it in public, but to her inner circle her words were clear. The men who had done this, her own grandson-in-law, her nephew, were not murderers. They were patriots. They were heroes. They had saved Russia. She believed for one glorious, shining moment that she had won. The spell was broken. The demon was gone. Now her poor, weak-willed Nicky would wake up. He would be freed from the German woman's control. He would return to the capital. He would appoint a new, sane government. The war would be won. The dynasty was saved. She waited. The whole country waited. And then the response came from the Tsar. And it was the one thing Maria had not, in her wildest nightmares, anticipated. Nicholas was not awake. He was not freed. He was furious. He was not angry at the demon who had destroyed his government. He was angry at the family who had killed his friend. He saw the murder not as an act of patriotism, but as an act of treason. It was a palace coup. His own family had taken the law into their own hands. And Alexandra, far from being freed, was shattered. She was not just grieving, she was consumed by a desire for apocalyptic vengeance. She demanded that the murderers be shot. Nicholas, as always, obeyed his wife. He could not shoot them, but he could punish them. He ordered the patriots arrested. Grand Duke Dmitri was exiled to the Persian front. Felix Yusupov, Maria's grandson-in-law, was exiled to his remote estates. This was the end. For Maria Feodorovna in Kiev, this was the final, fatal, soul-crushing blow. It was worse than the war. It was worse than 1905. It was the moment she realized her son was not just weak. He was gone. He was not a Romanov. He was not his father's son. He was a puppet, and he had just cut the last strings that connected him to his family, to his mother, and to sanity. He had chosen a dead, debauched peasant over the living, breathing, pleading Romanov dynasty. She and the entire Romanov clan sent one last desperate letter to the Tsar. "We beg you," they wrote, Do not punish these men. To all of Russia, they are heroes. To punish them is to make yourself an ally of a dead traitor. Nicholas's response was to return the letter with a note in the margin. No one has the right to commit murder. I know it is my family's duty to support me, the autocrat. He had learned nothing. It was over. Maria knew with a prophet's certainty that the revolution was no longer a threat. It was an inevitability. The murder of Rasputin had not stopped the end. It had been the last lurid Gothic chapter before the end. And the end came just 8 weeks later. In February 1917, the cold in Petrograd was unbearable. But the hunger was worse. The Rasputin Gatchina had left the capital's food supply in total chaos. The bakeries had no flour. On February 23rd, International Women's Day, a group of female textile workers, freezing and starving, walked out of their factories. They marched into the streets chanting, "Give us bread." The next day, more joined them. Then more. By February 25th, the entire city was on strike. Nicholas, at the front, received a telegram about the hooligan riots. He made his last fatal order as Tsar. He wrote back to the police chief in Petrograd, "I command you, stop this by tomorrow. Use all force necessary." The next day, the soldiers were ordered to fire on the crowds. And for the first time, the soldiers refused. They had been ordered to shoot their own starving mothers and sisters. Instead, they turned, shot their officers, and joined the revolution. The Pavlovsky Regiment, the elite guard, mutinied. Then another, then another. The arsenal was stormed. The police stations were burned. The government, the ministerial leapfrog, simply dissolved. They fled. In Kiev, Maria Feodorovna was trapped. The news was coming in, chaotic, terrifying. Petrograd is in flames. The ministers have fled. The Duma has formed a provisional committee. She was an empress with no empire. She was a mother, and her son was at the front, cut off. She was terrified for him. She had to get to him. And then the news came. The Duma and his own generals had surrounded the Tsar's train. They had told him the truth. "It is over. The army is not loyal. The people are gone. Your Majesty, for the good of Russia, you must abdicate." On March 15, 1917, Nicholas II, trapped, alone, and defeated, signed the paper. He abdicated not just for himself, but for his sick son, Alexei. He passed the throne to his brother, Misha, Maria's other son. When Maria Feodorovna in Kiev heard this, her entire world, which had been crumbling, finally turned to dust. He had done it, her son. He had given away the crown, the sacred trust of God, the legacy of her Sasha. He had just signed it away on a train like a bank slip. And he had done it without her, without consulting his mother, the Dowager Empress. Her terror for him was replaced for one final white-hot moment by an incandescent rage. She was not a mother. She was not a refugee. She was the Empress. And her son had just committed the ultimate sin. She ordered her private train. "We are going to Mogilev," she told her staff. "Now." She raced across a country that was collapsing into anarchy. Her train was stopped, searched by revolutionary soldiers. She was no longer the angel of Russia. She was Citizeness Romanov, the mother of the tyrant. But her will, her imperial bearing was so terrifying that the soldiers, awed, let her pass. She was a woman on fire. She was going to find her son. She was going to tell him what a fool he had been. She was going to tell him how he had betrayed his father, his country, and his God. She was going to unleash 23 years of frustration, shame, and fury upon his head. She arrived at the military headquarters in Mogilev. She stormed from the train, her small 70-year-old body rigid with rage. She walked into the building, and there he was. He was not the Tsar. He was not the autocrat. He was not the man who had ignored her. He was poor, weak-willed Nicky. He was standing in a corridor, in a simple, rumpled soldier's uniform. He was no longer under the protection of his generals. He was their prisoner. He looked small, tired, and very, very lost. He saw her, and he, a 48-year-old man, ran to his mother and wept. And in that instant, 50 years of imperial fury, of political rage, of shame and frustration evaporated. It was gone. The Empress was gone. Only the mother remained. She held him. She, who had been his greatest critic, was now his only defender. "My poor, poor Nicky," she wept. "You have been betrayed." This was the last time she would ever see him. In their 8 strange days as prisoners, her focus shifted from politics to survival. She secured a promise of asylum from her nephew, King George V of England, but the new government tore them apart. Maria was forced into a final agonizing goodbye. Watching her son be sent back to the wife she blamed for the entire catastrophe, Maria fled with the rest of her family to the Crimea. Their house arrest at Todor began as a polite, surreal paradise, but their hopes were shattered when King George V, fearing political backlash, rescinded the asylum offer. The door to escape had slammed shut. Then in November 1917, Lenin seized power. The polite guards vanished, replaced by ruthless, hateful Bolshevik sailors. The paradise became a real prison. The family faced starvation, humiliating searches, and psychological terror. Yet Maria, 70 and starving, remained the Empress. In a legendary act of defiance, she stared down the armed commissar who stormed her room, her icy authority so absolute that he and his men, terrified, backed away and apologized. As rumors of her son's murders grew, she built a fortress of denial, forbidding anyone from mourning. The terror peaked when the local Soviet ordered their execution. As the family braced for the firing squad, they were saved by a bizarre miracle. A rival Bolshevik faction stormed the palace, not to save the Romanovs, but to arrest their jailers over a jurisdictional dispute. They survived the infighting, only to be trapped again. The Red Army was closing in, and just as all hope was lost, a new, disciplined army appeared. It was not the Reds. It was the German army. In the spring of 1918, a new disciplined sound echoed up to the Todor Palace. It was not the screams of drunken Bolshevik sailors. It was the rhythmic marching of infantry. The Red Terror had evaporated overnight, replaced by the German Imperial Army. For Maria Feodorovna, this was not salvation. It was the ultimate humiliation of her life. She, who had spent her entire political career fighting German influence, who despised her nephew Kaiser Wilhelm II as an arrogant fool, was now a guest being protected by his very army. A German general came to assure her that the Kaiser had sent him to ensure the safety of the Tsar's mother. Maria treated him with the same icy contempt she had reserved for the Bolshevik commissar. She understood this was a political game. The Kaiser was not saving her. He was securing an asset to perhaps negotiate with or to install a pro-German puppet regime. Life under the Germans was a bitter paradise. The physical terror was gone. Food began to arrive. For the first time in a year, the family could breathe, but it was a poisoned, shameful air. Maria locked herself away, refusing to be a pawn. And it was in this strange, quiet, humiliating safety that the real horror began. It began with silence. The mail from her son Nicky, who was imprisoned in Yekaterinburg, suddenly stopped. His last letter, dated April 1918, had been bizarrely cheerful, and then just nothing. Into this vast, terrifying silence, the rumors began to seep. They were no longer the taunts of guards, but fragmented whispers carried by terrified white Russian refugees fleeing south, each story escalating the horror. It started with a published report that the Tsar had been shot by the Ural Soviet. Maria dismissed it as propaganda, but the story didn't stop there. It metastasized. A more horrific whisper followed. It wasn't just the Tsar, but the entire family. The net of horror widened, pulling in everyone else. News trickled in that her son, Misha, had disappeared in Perm, shot in a forest. This was followed by the most hideous story of all. Her sister-in-law, Ella, the nun, and her nephews had been thrown alive down a mine shaft. Faced with this tidal wave of unbearable information, Maria Feodorovna, the ultimate pragmatist, made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She activated the Great Denial. She declared it all to be lies, German or Bolshevik propaganda. This was not madness. It was a conscious, calculated strategy for survival. She forbade her family from mourning. She commanded them to hope, because to accept the truth that her sons, her grandchildren, her entire life's work had been butchered in a cellar was to accept that her entire life, her marriage, her 50 years in Russia, and her faith, all of it, was a grotesque, meaningless, and bloody failure. It was too much to bear, and so it was not true. My Nicky is alive, she told herself. The world collapsed again in November 1918. Germany lost the Great War. The effect was immediate. The German army, her shield, was now a defeated rabble. They received orders to evacuate the Crimea. Her protectors packed their bags, boarded their ships, and left, leaving a vast power vacuum. Maria and her family were completely abandoned. She refused. She would not leave without her extended family, friends, and most importantly, the loyal Cossack soldiers who had risked their lives to protect her. She, the Dowager Empress of all Russia, would not scramble onto a lifeboat and abandon her subjects to be slaughtered on the docks. Captain Johnson, caught between his king's orders and the unshakable will of an empress, had to resort to a firm hand. He politely but definitively informed her that HMS Marlborough would be leaving, with or without her, and he could not guarantee the safety of anyone who remained. Once the Red Army overran the port, it was the moment the harsh truth struck. Faced with the devastating choice that her resistance meant a death sentence for the very people she was trying to protect, Maria finally relented. In the chaotic hours that followed, nearly 80 members of the Romanov dynasty, aristocrats, and loyal attendants scrambled aboard. As HMS Marlborough weighed anchor and left Yalta harbor, Maria Feodorovna stood on the deck. She was 71 years old, a widow, bereaved of her sons, and this was the last time she would ever see Russian soil. The revolution was total. The bitter exile had begun. The ship took her to England, where she reunited tearfully with her sister, Queen Alexandra. But England was too damp, and the grief there was too heavy. Her heart was still in Russia, but her body longed for her homeland of Denmark. Finally, she returned to where it all began, Copenhagen. This was the most tragic chapter of her life. She settled at Vidura, a seaside villa she co-owned with her sister. But this was not a peaceful retirement. It was a waiting room of denial. Maria Feodorovna, until the very last day of her life, flatly refused to believe that her sons, Nicky and Michael, were dead. She dismissed every report, every piece of evidence, every witness account. She was convinced they had escaped and were hiding somewhere in Russia, biding their time. She lived in a permanent state of anticipation, hoping for a door to open, a letter to arrive, carrying news that Nicky was safe. She received countless letters from imposters claiming to be her sons, and she funded costly investigations to find her lost family. Yet when a young woman, Anna Anderson, appeared in Berlin and began capturing the world's attention by claiming to be her granddaughter, Anastasia. Maria did something startling. She refused to meet her. Many believe she simply knew it was a fraud. But there is also a more painful explanation. For Maria, it was all or nothing. She would rather cling to the fragile hope that all of them were safe, rather than concede the terrible truth that most of them were dead just to get back one single fragment. To accept Anastasia would be to accept that Nikki was gone forever. Her life in exile was a phantom existence. She was the living embodiment of a fallen empire, a dowager empress with no empire, a mother who refused to mourn. She outlived her sons, she outlived her husband's empire, and she outlived the entire world she had once dominated. On October 13th, 1928, at the age of 80, Maria Feodorovna's indomitable heart finally stopped beating. She died in Denmark, her native homeland, but in her mind, she had never truly left Russia. She was buried in Denmark, but that was not the end. Nearly 80 years later, in 2006, her remains were exhumed. In a solemn state ceremony, her coffin was returned to St. Petersburg and interred beside her beloved husband, Tsar Alexander III, fulfilling her final wish. The last dowager Empress of Russia had finally come home.